reversed.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I've asserted many times that the best quality medieval sword steel was spring steel. Specifically, that you can do this with it, all right? And there's been a number of people who have challenged me on that assertion, and I have responded to them with points of evidence that we see in artwork of people quite literally doing this in the artwork, okay? Pretty direct, clear evidence that the swords depicted in that artwork were spring steel, though I have had one person, a more prominent person who makes sword-related content, actually tried to challenge even the artwork to say, what if they were purposefully bending the sword for some type of sword technique, which I find to be honestly a ridiculous assertion, because it doesn't appear in any type of fight, like, you know, treatise, fighting manual, and I can't think of any reason why you'd ever want to do that purposely to your sword. No, you wouldn't want to damage your sword for a sword technique like that. But people challenge me on that. And then I've come back to them to point out that spring steel was used quite widely in the later medieval period for crossbow bows. You know the limbs on crossbows? Yeah, we have them in art, surviving examples. The surviving examples come from the Renaissance, but we have ones that date to the late medieval period in artwork showing pretty clear steel limbs on crossbows, and you can only make those out of spring steel. And then people have challenged me on that again to say that's more of an anomaly because it's not bending too much and it's really thick, but you wouldn't really get away with that in a sword blade. And these sword blades that we have here where you can do this is a more modern kind of phenomenon. And when we look at museum examples, they are not spring swords. Well, recently a video was released where something was shown that I was very excited to see because I've never actually seen this before. So Adam Savage from Mythbusters fame has a YouTube channel called Tested, and Adam, a bit of a man after my own heart. He has a great, deep love and appreciation for medieval stuff, especially, more specifically, swords and armor. And he's had the privilege to go to museum collections and handle historical swords. And recently he made a video where he was looking at, well, a sword that not only do I find very interesting, we actually have a sword that is based off of that very one in the museum. This is the Baylor Arms Oakshot Type 18C sword. Another name for this sword is an Alexandrian sword. It's not because they were made in Alexandria. It's that the museum piece that this sword is based off, and this isn't a perfect replica of that museum piece, by the way, but they were, a number of these swords were donated to kind of the barracks that it was in Alexandria, and there they stayed preserved pretty well. And what's really interesting, you have an inscription that also gives us a date of when they were given as gifts. And so these are European swords given to Alexandria, and the date is like 1410. So this is really early 15th century, and a good chance that, actually it might have been a bit later, was it 1415, something like that, but really early 15th century, with the possibility that these swords actually were made in, well, depending how old they were at the time. What that establishes is that swords like this, obviously, you can put a bit of room before and after the point where we can really define where this sword appears. So that means swords like this very likely were around in the late 14th century. It's really significant because the museum curator does something with this Alexandrian sword. This is one of my favorite swords. The profile, it is made to accentuate and cutting. Like, these swords are gorgeous, right? He grabs the sword and does this with the museum piece. It's a 500-year-old sword. And they're that confident to show it has a spring temper on the sword, and, well, like, I'll show you the footage there, springing it. And not only I was surprised that they would do that, but they were confident enough in the quality of the sword and how well it survives to show the spring temper on the sword. And then Adam, when he grabs it, he also does it as well. And then the curator says that there are multiple swords that have spring temper on them. Some so much so that when you just hold them out like this, they actually flex down because of the weight of the sword itself. And so hopefully we can, if anyone is questioning my assertions that absolutely there were many late medieval swords, not all of them, okay, in the actual fact the majority, I would still say, was not spring steel. But to say it was only like a couple, one or two, or just they weren't really round or the quality was different, that you couldn't do this on them, is wrong. No. It's actually a larger number of spring steel swords than many people have tried to, I guess, contradict me on in the medieval period, because it wasn't just the Alexandrian sword. There are other surviving swords that have the spring temper still on the sword. This is remarkable for a number of reasons, because it goes into, I guess, a caution I would give people when they try and say barely any at all was spring steel. A lot of medieval swords are not in good condition in the museums, okay? Actual period pieces, you see quite a lot of rust and damage to them, and varying degrees of damage. Now, we can get certain amounts of information from these more damaged, rusted swords, but to assume that it's going to have the exact same quenching and tempering state that it had right after manufacturing is not something that I would advise people assert with great confidence, because when you have a sword that is aged and worn over a very long period of time, we're looking at 500 years. We don't know what type of abuse that sword has gone through over that entire period. When it comes to severe rust and damage, do you think the temper is going to be in perfect, like remained intact perfectly on the blade throughout that period? I would say what's more likely, no. The temper can get ruined on a sword. Now, usually the sword has to get reheated up to ruin the temper, heated up too much or any other things. But when it comes to severe damage like rust and corrosion that was really penetrating deep into the blade, yeah, absolutely that'll ruin the temper on a sword. Now, I'm not saying that means all, these rusted kind of like damaged swords had a spring temper. I still believe that most medieval swords probably would not spring steel, but a good number of the highest quality ones absolutely were. We have proof in art, multiple sources from swords as well as, of course, crossbows, and now surviving examples where we have been shown the actual spring temper. This is significant because when we have tested swords here on the channel, and not only us, heaps of other people, the swords that seem to hold up to the most abuse are spring steel swords. There has been some, I guess, challenges to that assertion that I would like to address in this video, and I'll go through them. So one of the challenges is that these are actually modern steel swords. It's not fair to compare these to the historical steel spring swords because they will not be as good. That is true to an extent, but to say that you can't gain information or use them as a mild analog to get information on how spring steel performs. And also, by the way, when it comes to katanas, like this more traditional, it has folded steel in it, differential hardening on it, and we've tested this multiple times, and it wasn't as durable as this medieval bastard sword. This is also made out of modern steel, okay? It's made in a more traditional way, but the steel used is modern steel, and what we're comparing then is the difference in, I guess, the methods of finalizing the sword. Differential hardening, okay, with actual kind of softer core versus spring steel temper on it. Both modern steel, and so we can get a point of comparison, because the advantages that this sword is getting out of in terms of having a more pure grade of steel than historical counterparts is the advantages this one is getting out of it. And so therefore there are points of references that we can gain from comparing the quality or durability of these swords. The other thing is, yes, modern steel is far superior to historical steel in most cases. You would be pretty shocked at how high quality certain historical steels could get in terms of their purity. Now, I'm not talking about the ones where we have refined multiple additional inclusions, like a very specific amount of silicon and stuff like that, where we get to something what we consider space age. But if we're talking about pretty basic 1060 high carbon steel that has no real other additions apart from it's got ferrite, iron, and carbon at the right percentage, okay? In terms of impurities, there were historical steels that could come pretty close to modern steel quality. Not exactly, modern steel will always be better, but pretty close. And the overall performance at the end of the day is somewhat comparable, even though the modern sword will ultimately be better. but that difference can sometimes be so small that you might not notice too much of a difference in end performance. And I'm comparing to the best though, okay? I'm not saying all medieval swords were reaching that standard. But if you were to compare the best quality, where is my point of reference? So a great documentary was done on the Ulfbert sword. The Ulfbert swords are Scandinavian swords, usually, you know, Viking style swords or Viking period swords, right? Of exceptional quality. When I say exceptional, they've looked at the microstructure of the steel and it is close to modern quality in terms of its purity.
After 5 hours, it's time to see if he has successfully made a crucible steel ingot. An examination of the microstructure with a scanning electron microscope will reveal whether Rick has succeeded in making a slag-free, pure steel. The image is nearly free of slag and other inclusions that appear as dark circles.
This would be a fairly decent steel today.
This is crucible steel. They assume that it was most likely imported, but there's no guarantee, because it's hard to say how this steel appeared in Scandinavia. These swords definitely were made in Scandinavia, and because this quality, we know this quality of steel was being made in, say, India. Okay, if we know that they're making this quality of steel, India could have been traded up into the Scandinavian regions, but there is a chance that they just, some, you know, rare smith that didn't want to share the secret knew how to make it as well. The Ulfbert swords are shockingly high quality, okay? And in this documentary, they actually looked at the microstructure, like I said, and they said, this is close to modern quality in terms of purity. And when I'm saying modern quality, that also is referencing a lot of crucible steels across the board. Now, crucible steels can be really high quality because it's not bloomery steel. It's a sealed crucible, and if you get the temperature high enough, the inclusions, the non-metallic inclusions, the slag, rise to the surface in the smelt within the crucible, and it can get really good quality steel. That's not the only way to get really good quality high carbon steel, especially in the late medieval period when they started using blast furnaces, which fully liquefies the iron and then they pour it out into molds, and they were actually making cast iron, and then there's a refining process to reduce the carbon into high carbon steel. And so there were ways to make very pure high carbon steel in the medieval period that you can actually look at being somewhat close to modern quality in terms of purity. Not modern quality steels in terms of very refined kind of balances of different additions. I'm just saying we're looking at the carbon grade steels here, all right? And so therefore, using a modern basic 1060 high carbon steel blade, which is it's just 1060 high carbon steel, is far more fair than people have been accusing it of saying it's a complete night and day comparison, that no medieval sword would ever be made even close to the quality of this modern steel sword, when actually, no, there are some historical examples of steels of exceptionally high, near modern quality. It's more rare, but they're absolutely there. So then we come to the assertion about consistent quality that some people are trying to counter with, you know, pointing out that it was done in crossbow limbs, saying that the crossbow limbs, they're not bending that much. And I think they're getting thrown out a bit by the size differences. The limb is only that big and it's only bending that amount. Like if it's only bending, I don't know, even 10, 20% of off straight, okay, it doesn't look like much of a bend when it's a really small kind of angle and you can barely see it. If you multiply that same bend over a longer line, okay, suddenly you're reaching similar kind of bends. Like, see this bend here on this sword? If you would actually only look at how much this portion of the blade is bending when I do this, it doesn't look like that much, does it? Okay? So I think people are getting thrown off by a bit of an optical illusion, because the thing is, when you're using spring steel on crossbows, which the very purpose of it is to bend and then flex back, all right, you need very consistent spring steel to be able to make it so it's reliable. And when I say reliable, you're pretty confident that it's not going to break in general use, all right? Of course, there would have been breaks, but they wouldn't be making multiple crossbows with spring steel if the steel was not reliable, and they couldn't make a reliable, consistent weapon as a result. Because we have a number of surviving examples that still have the spring temper on them, all right, This means that the knowledge in making spring steel in the medieval period was, when I say widespread, like not every sword, but widespread enough that, like, because you think these museum ones were the only ones? No, if there's multiple museum examples, spring tempers on them, all right, we see examples in art and on crossbows, that means there is a lot more swords that did not survive all the way through to now that were of similar quality, and the knowledge in how to make them obviously was widespread enough to explain the fact that they even knew how to make them, and we can safely assume that there was a good number of swords of this quality existing in the medieval period. So there we go, spring steel, medieval swords, more common than the naysayers are saying, not widespread where every single medieval sword is made that way, because there are multiple different methods, techniques to make swords. Like Toledo steel, for instance, was folded steel with a combination of low and high carbon steel, and they were very well known for being really good quality swords. Then of course there are the museum examples that we can more reliably, you know, conclude that the temper probably isn't ruined on the swords, and what we're analyzing from the blade is a more accurate indicator of what it was like after it was made. But then there are other ones where you probably don't want to assume too much about its quality because of how damaged it is. And then we have the museum piece, of course, that it was pretty, like, I loved seeing that video. It was just a gorgeous thing to see. Thank you for watching. I hope to hear your comments in the comment section below. Share your thoughts, love to see them. If you want to see how this Alexandrian kind of inspired sword holds up, I do have a dedicated review on this sword specifically, and it's a pretty cool sword, honestly. Like, oh, they did a good job. And there's a reason why I love this style. The video's right here, you can click on it. Don't miss it, like, it's fun, check it out. See how awesome this sword is. I hope to see you there, and until that time, farewell.